The Pacific was burning. From the moment the sun rose over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and turned the waters of Oahu into a furnace of oil and fire, the balance of the world had tilted. Japan's empire was surging outward like a tide of steel and banners. In 6 months, they had seized the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Every headline screamed the same truth. The rising sun was ascendant, and America was reeling. But beneath the surface of this chaos, far from the headlines and the roar of guns, another war had begun. It was a war fought not with torpedoes or aircraft, but with paper, pencils, and silence. In a low, windowless building at Pearl Harbor's naval base, a small group of men and women sat hunched over desks covered in cryptograms and intercepted transmissions. They were the members of Station HYPO, the U.S. Navy's code-breaking unit, led by an eccentric, chain-smoking intelligence officer named Commander Joseph J. Rochefort. Around him worked a dozen of America's most unassuming warriors: mathematicians, linguists, radio technicians, and typists. They didn't wear flight suits or carry rifles. Their tools were dictionaries, slide rules, and infinite patience. Yet the fate of the Pacific would soon rest in their ink-stained hands. The enemy's greatest weapon wasn't its aircraft carriers or its Zero fighters. It was silence, the encoded network of Japanese communications that connected their entire empire. Every fleet movement, every convoy, every order passed through a cipher known as JN25, a sprawling system of more than 33,000 code groups, each translated through a constantly changing additive cipher. To most, it was unbreakable. To Rochefort and his team, it was a challenge. Their workroom was called the dungeon, not because of its darkness, but because of the men who rarely left it. They slept in cots beside their desks, surviving on black coffee and stale cigarettes. The air was thick with humidity, the sound of typewriters, and the faint static from the shortwave receivers that captured enemy signals. Each day brought hundreds of intercepted fragments, all meaningless strings of numbers: 14873, 39402, 22210, 57194, 10982, 00731. But inside those numbers hid a map of the war, if only they could find the key. Rochefort was unlike any officer in the Navy. He wore a bathrobe and slippers instead of a uniform, shuffled through the office with his pipe clamped between his teeth, and cursed like a sailor even in front of admirals. But beneath that odd exterior was one of the sharpest minds in naval intelligence. He had studied Japanese since the 1920s and understood that language was as much about rhythm and instinct as vocabulary. He told his team, "We're not breaking numbers, we're breaking people." By early 1942, as Japan continued its advance, the cryptanalysts of Station HYPO were beginning to make progress. Working in parallel with other Allied intelligence centers like OP-20G in Washington and Frumel in Melbourne, they had begun reconstructing portions of JN25. Every intercepted message yielded a fragment, a ship name, a location, a date. Bit by bit, they were piecing together a ghost map of Japanese operations. It was painstaking, invisible work. While the newspapers raged about battles lost and bases abandoned, Rochefort's team sat surrounded by paper walls, their eyes burning from sleepless nights and their fingers blackened with carbon dust. To the outside world, they were clerks. To Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, they were the faint hope that America might one day fight back on equal terms. By March, the team noticed something unusual: repeated references in Japanese traffic to an operation involving a location designated only as AF. Messages spoke of supplies being prepared, reconnaissance aircraft being staged, and special units being assembled. But no one knew where AF was. Some in Washington thought it meant Fiji, Others suggested Moresby or even Hawaii. Rochefort wasn't convinced. His instincts told him it was something smaller, something isolated. He leaned over the cluttered table one night, pointing at a weather report intercepted from a Japanese naval station. "He's got temperatures and wind speeds down here. That's not for a big city. That's for an island." His assistant, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, nodded. There was one island the Japanese had scouted for months, one small coral atoll sitting in the middle of the Pacific like a stone in a pond. Midway. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway, but instinct wasn't enough. He needed proof. While the analysts worked in secrecy, far above them the war machines continued to grind. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was planning the next blow, an operation that would lure what remained of the U.S. Navy into a trap and destroy it. The Japanese had humiliated America at Pearl Harbor, but Yamamoto knew that the U.S. industrial machine would recover. To secure Japan's future, he needed one decisive battle, one that would cripple America beyond repair. His plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. A massive strike force would approach the tiny island of Midway from the northwest, capturing it and extending Japan's defensive perimeter. When the Americans came to defend it, the Japanese carriers would ambush and annihilate them. Yamamoto's officers were confident. Japan's navy was still the most powerful on Earth, and its pilots were unmatched. They called the operation MI. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans were already listening. Rochefort's team had cracked enough of JN-25 to understand key fragments, fleet movements, code words, and unit designations. But without confirmation, their warnings were met with skepticism in Washington. The Navy's high command had been burned before by false alarms, and so Station HYPO decided to do something daring. They would bait the enemy into revealing the truth. Rochefort contacted Midway's garrison through a secure channel and ordered them to send an unencrypted radio message stating that the island's fresh water condenser was broken, that they were running out of water. It was a risky move. If the Japanese intercepted it, they would learn the Americans knew something was coming. Days passed. Then on May 20th, 1942, a new encrypted message appeared in JN-25 traffic. AF reports water shortage. Rochefort dropped his pipe and said, "There it is. AF is Midway." Within hours, Admiral Nimitz had the confirmation he needed. The Japanese weren't just moving, they were coming for Midway. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States would not be surprised. In the quiet rooms beneath Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team watched the map unfold. The intercepts grew clearer. The Japanese would attack in the first week of June, with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, the same that had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The realization sent a chill through the room. The hunters were coming again. But this time, they would not find their prey helpless. As Rochefort wrote in his diary that night, "We have seen the enemy's mind. Now we must be ready for his hand." Above them, the calm Pacific rolled on, blue and endless, concealing both fleets and fate. The stage for one of the greatest naval battles in history had been set, not by admirals, not by guns, but by men in a windowless room who had broken Japan's silence. And when the battle came, it would not be won by surprise. It would be won by knowledge. In the spring of 1942, while most of the U.S. Navy scrambled to rebuild its shattered fleet, the men of Station HYPO were already fighting the next battle, one that existed only in fragments of numbers and whispered radio static. It was a battle of patience, fought in windowless rooms by men whose weapons were pencils and brains. Each day, the intercept operators in the Hawaiian Hills recorded the endless chatter of Japanese transmissions, coded weather reports, fleet orders, supply manifests, all encrypted with the same mysterious cipher, JN-25B.
the backbone of the Imperial Navy's communications. To a casual observer, it was gibberish. But to Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team, it was the heartbeat of Japan's war machine, a pulse that could be read if you listened closely enough. Rochefort stood over the desks, pipe in hand, watching his analysts arrange the intercepts into long, scrolling columns of numbers. Each message was a wall of digits, five-figure groups that seemed impenetrable. The air smelled of tobacco and sweat, and the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of typewriter keys. Every new intercept was a riddle. Each solved group, a spark of light in the dark. For months they had been breaking fragments, ship names, weather references, partial locations, but now a pattern was emerging. Messages kept referencing AF. It was always the same. Supply requests for AF, reconnaissance over AF, air groups assigned to attack AF. Rochefort's intuition screamed that AF was a target, but which one? Washington's intelligence branch, OP-20G, argued that AF referred to some base in the South Pacific, perhaps Fiji or the Aleutians. Rochefort disagreed. His gut told him it was Midway Atoll, the lonely speck of coral halfway between Hawaii and Japan. He had studied Japanese communications for years. He knew their rhythm, their priorities. Midway was small, but strategically vital, a stepping stone toward Hawaii itself. Still, gut instinct wasn't enough to convince Admiral Nimitz. The codebreakers needed proof. On May 19, 1942, Rochefort devised one of the cleverest ruses in the history of intelligence warfare. He had Midway's garrison send an unencrypted radio message reporting that their freshwater condenser had broken down and that they were short on water. It was a dangerous move. Broadcasting any real information openly could alert the Japanese that their codes were compromised. But the gamble paid off. 2 days later, Japanese communications lit up with a new encrypted message. AF reports water shortage. The room went silent. The numbers might as well have been thunder. Rochefort turned to his staff, pipe clenched between his teeth, and grinned. "That's it," he said quietly. "AF is Midway." With that single confirmation, the fog lifted. Now they knew exactly where Japan would strike, and when. The intercepted fragments indicated the attack would occur in early June, and that 4 of Japan's fleet carriers, the same that had bombed Pearl Harbor, would be leading the assault. Rochefort immediately sent a report to Admiral Nimitz. The message was simple. Midway will be attacked on or about 3 to 5 June by a large Japanese fleet, including 4 carriers. Nimitz didn't hesitate. He had trusted Rochefort before, and now he trusted him again. The Pacific Fleet's commander began to plan an ambush, one so daring that even his own staff thought it impossible. While the enemy prepared for a trap they believed was theirs, the Americans were setting one of their own. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, outlined his grand plan. Operation MI, the invasion of Midway. He envisioned it as the decisive battle that would draw out and annihilate what remained of the U.S. Navy. The Japanese fleet would sail in multiple task groups, converging on Midway from different directions. The first air fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, carried 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū. Behind them, Yamamoto's main body, with the super battleship Yamato, would wait to finish off the Americans once their carriers were destroyed. It was a flawless plan, except that every step was already known. In the dim light of Station HYPO, the cryptanalysts tracked the Japanese fleet's radio silence, noting which transmitters went dark and which resumed. From that silence, they could infer movement. They plotted lines on the map, one fleet moving north toward the Aleutians as a diversion, another sweeping east toward Midway. Rochefort smiled grimly. He said, "They think they're invisible. They're not." Each day brought new pieces of the puzzle: call signs, ship groupings, logistics schedules, all cross-checked and confirmed. The more the Japanese transmitted, the more their plan unfolded. And yet the work never became easier. The stress was crushing. Sleep came in 1-hour bursts. Rochefort's men lived on coffee and adrenaline. Their nerves stretched thin. They knew the fate of thousands of sailors, perhaps the entire Pacific Fleet, depended on what they could read in time. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright wrote in his log, "We are living in a world of ghosts, numbers that whisper of fleets and deaths we cannot yet see, but they are coming." Meanwhile, Admiral Nimitz began moving his pieces quietly across the board. He ordered 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to assemble northeast of Midway, hidden just beyond Japan's scouting range. Their mission was simple and suicidal: to ambush a superior Japanese fleet. The odds were terrifying. Japan had more ships, more aircraft, more experience, but Nimitz held the one advantage that mattered: knowledge. Every intercepted message refined the picture. Every decrypted word made the trap tighter. Still, Rochefort worried. What if Japan changed its codes before the attack? What if a single clue was misread? What if his deception had failed and they were walking into a slaughter? His doubts gnawed at him, but he never showed them. Instead, he kept the room alive with dry humor and relentless focus. When the final pre-battle transmissions came through, fleet positions, refueling schedules, and carrier launch timings, the analysts worked until dawn. At last, the pattern was undeniable. He wrote one final message to Nimitz: "Enemy carriers will strike Midway dawn 4 June. Suggest your forces be in position to intercept." And then he sat back in his chair, eyes hollow, pipe cold. He had done all he could. Now the war would move from the world of ghosts to the world of fire. Out on the ocean, 3,000 miles away, the Japanese fleet steamed eastward under the shroud of secrecy, unaware that every bearing and heading they transmitted had already been marked on American charts. Nagumo's officers believed in the divine advantage of surprise. They had no idea that their enemy had been waiting for them, quietly, precisely, and patiently. As May gave way to June, Rochefort's team gathered around their radios one last time. The static from the Pacific filled the room like distant thunder. The storm they had predicted was about to break. And this time, it would be Japan's turn to face surprise.
The dawn of June 3, 1942, broke quiet and perfect over the Pacific. The kind of morning that seemed incapable of violence. The ocean stretched to infinity, a mirror of blue glass beneath a sky so clear it hurt the eyes. But somewhere beyond that horizon, death was coming. A Japanese armada, more than 200 ships, was closing in on Midway, confident, silent, and unseen. They believed the sea belonged to them. They believed the Americans were blind. They were wrong. Hidden far to the northeast, 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited in the open ocean. Their decks were alive with movement, aircraft fueled, bombs armed, engines checked, crews pacing in silence. They were ghosts beneath the waves of Japanese overconfidence, lying in wait exactly where Admiral Nimitz had placed them, guided not by radar or scouts, but by the invisible hand of intelligence. Station HYPO's invisible war had led them here. Every bearing, every heading, every expected time of contact came from the minds of men who had never left their basement in Pearl Harbor. For the Americans, the trap was set. For the Japanese, it was still a perfect day. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet,
stood on the bridge of Akagi, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Around him, the other carriers, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, steamed in perfect formation, their decks stacked with Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes. Below decks, mechanics worked in near silence, refueling and arming aircraft for the morning strike. Nagumo was confident. Every Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor had been swift and total. His pilots were the finest in the world, his carriers invincible. The Americans, he believed, only had 2 surviving flat tops, both crippled. His scouts reported no enemy presence. Yamamoto's plan was working perfectly. Midway would fall within a day, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet would come too late to save it. At 4:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted from the decks and roared east toward Midway Atoll. Among them were veteran pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They expected another easy slaughter. They were met instead by a storm. As the Japanese planes approached Midway, anti-aircraft guns opened up from the atoll's defenses. Black bursts of shrapnel filled the morning sky. American Marine and Navy pilots scrambled from their makeshift runways, climbing into the path of the incoming raid in outdated Brewster Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats. It was chaos, bravery against inevitability. The Japanese bombers rained destruction across the island, but Midway's defenses held. When the first wave returned around 700 hours, they brought mixed news. The runways were damaged but not destroyed. The airfield was still operational. Nagumo now faced a choice: launch a second strike to finish the job, or rearm his planes with anti-ship weapons in case the American fleet appeared. He hesitated. Reports were unclear. His scouts hadn't found any carriers. Believing the Americans were still hundreds of miles away, he ordered his planes to be refueled and rearmed for a second land strike. It was a fatal decision. At 7:28 hours, one of Nagumo's scouts, a delayed float plane from the cruiser Tone, finally reported what it should have found hours earlier. Enemy force sighted, bearing 10 degrees. Ships include aircraft carrier. For a moment, the bridge of Akagi fell silent. Nagumo's eyes narrowed. A carrier? Here? It was impossible. Yet the radio crackled again. Confirmation. The Americans were not only nearby, they were in perfect position to strike. Nagumo immediately ordered his crews to switch from land bombs to torpedoes, a complex and time-consuming process. Below decks, hundreds of men rushed to disarm, move, and reload aircraft as fuel hoses hissed and bombs clanked on steel. The carrier's hangars became ticking bombs. Above deck, flight crews waited nervously, unaware that death was already falling toward them. Far to the northeast, aboard Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance and Vice Admiral Jack Frank Fletcher had been waiting for that moment. They had gambled everything on Rochefort's intelligence. Now, with the Japanese fleet located, the time for silence was over. "Launch the strike," Spruance ordered. At 700 hours, the decks came alive. Enterprise and Hornet began launching wave after wave of aircraft: 67 Dauntless dive bombers, 29 Devastator torpedo planes, and 20 Wildcats. The roar of engines filled the air as the squadron circled into formation and disappeared into the bright blue morning. From Yorktown, another 37 planes followed. The Japanese had no idea they were being hunted. The first American planes to reach the Japanese fleet were the slow, vulnerable TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, flying barely 100 knots, skimming the sea like insects. They attacked without fighter cover, charging directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zeros. One by one, they were cut down. Of the 41 torpedo planes launched that morning, 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo found its target. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The chaos they created, the twisting zeros, the frantic maneuvers, the carriers turning hard to avoid torpedoes, left the Japanese decks wide open and distracted. And just as the last torpedo bomber fell flaming into the sea, a second sound began to rise above the ocean. A distant, growing roar from the clouds above. From 20,000 feet, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of Enterprise and Yorktown had arrived. At 2200 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCleskey, leading the Enterprise group, spotted the Japanese fleet below. The carriers were in a perfect target formation, turning into the wind, decks covered with fueled aircraft, bombs stacked on the hangar floors. McCleskey led his planes into a steep dive, screaming through the clouds at 250 knots. Dive! 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 The Dauntlesses fell like spears of vengeance. The first bomb struck Kaga midships, igniting fuel lines and detonating the bombs below deck. Within seconds, the entire ship became a volcano of flame. Moments later, Akagi took a direct hit through her flight deck, one single 1,000-pound bomb that exploded in her hangar, setting off a chain reaction. Across the horizon, Sōryū was hit 3 times in quick succession, engulfed in fire. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, the same that had bombed Pearl Harbor, were mortally wounded. On board Akagi, Nagumo could only watch in horror as his flagship burned. He turned to his staff and whispered, "How could they have known?" By the end of the day, the last Japanese carrier, Hiryū, launched 2 desperate counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown but was soon found and destroyed by returning American bombers. The sky that had begun so calm was now filled with black smoke and falling wreckage. The Pacific, moments earlier serene, churned with oil and fire. When the sun set on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers lay beneath the waves. The Imperial Navy's air arm, the pride of its empire, had been obliterated in a single day. Far away in the basement of Station HYPO, Rochefort's men listened to the intercepted Japanese signals turn to chaos. Transmissions broke down into fragments, then silence. They exchanged weary smiles, though few spoke. They had seen it happen in numbers before anyone else had seen it in fire. For them, the battle was not about ships or bombs, it was about words, about ghosts they had hunted in the static and finally exorcised. The trap had worked. The silence of Station HYPO had shattered Japan's illusion of invincibility. And as the Pacific night fell, the course of the war turned with the tide.
The Pacific that night glowed red. The fires of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, burned across the horizon, mirrored in the black water like dying suns. The air was thick with oil smoke and the crackling thunder of explosions below decks. In one afternoon, the core of the Imperial Navy's striking power, the same force that had leveled Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was gone. It was the sound of history tilting, a moment when one empire began to fall and another began to rise. But victory had not come cheaply. The crews of the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, spent the night fighting fires, repairing decks, and rescuing the survivors of their own shattered squadrons. The sea around them was littered with debris, life rafts, wreckage, the bodies of pilots who had fallen without witnesses. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had charged into the wall of Japanese Zeros that morning, only 6 had returned. Their sacrifice had cleared the skies for the Dauntlesses that struck the fatal blows. Admiral Nimitz, watching the battle unfold from his command post in Pearl Harbor, received the first reports late that night. 3 enemy carriers burning, one message read. Hours later came another, 4th carrier sinking. Nimitz exhaled slowly and murmured, "This changes everything." In the smoldering wreckage of the Japanese fleet, chaos reigned. On board the dying Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge as his flagship burned around him.
The steel deck beneath his feet was so hot it blistered his boots. Crewmen screamed, some jumping into the sea to escape the inferno. The once proud carrier that had led the Pearl Harbor strike was now a gutted hulk. Nagumo, stunned and silent, could not comprehend what had happened. How? How did they know? No one answered. The crew tried desperately to control the fires, but it was hopeless. Aviation fuel lines ran like veins through the ship, carrying flames deeper with every minute. Bombs and torpedoes, still waiting to be loaded, began to detonate one by one, each explosion tearing the vessel apart. The Akagi's captain, Aoki Taijiro, requested permission to scuttle the ship. Nagumo gave a single nod. At 19:20 hours, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the burning hulk. The Akagi rolled slowly, her red, rising sun flag still fluttering in the wind, before slipping beneath the waves. The ocean swallowed her whole. Nearby, Kaga and Sōryū had already been abandoned, their decks twisted like molten glass. The Hiryū, the last surviving carrier, had fought until dusk, launching 2 desperate counterattacks that crippled Yorktown, but by evening, she too had been found. American dive bombers from Enterprise struck her at 1700 hours, setting her ablaze. By midnight, her surviving crew gathered on deck, singing the Navy hymn Umi Yukaba before abandoning ship. 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and more than 3,000 trained sailors and pilots, the elite of Japan's naval air arm, were gone. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's headquarters fell silent as reports filtered in. First disbelief, then dread. The words, 4 carriers lost, passed through the corridors like a death sentence. The Japanese press was ordered to suppress the news. Officers who had once walked with swagger now spoke in hushed tones. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, the loss was almost unbearable. He had designed the Pearl Harbor strike to cripple America's will. Now, 6 months later, the very carriers that had carried out his dream lay at the bottom of the ocean. In his flagship Yamato, still hundreds of miles west, Yamamoto received Nagumo's final transmission. The message was brief. Enemy dive bombers caused devastating damage. Situation hopeless. Preparing to abandon ships. Yamamoto stared at the telegram for a long time. Then he turned to his chief of staff and said quietly, "The gods have turned against us." That night, he ordered the withdrawal of the remaining fleet. For the first time since the war began, the Imperial Navy was in retreat. On the American side, the victory was so sudden, so complete, that it took hours for the reality to sink in. When the pilots of Enterprise returned, exhausted and nearly out of fuel, they were greeted with cheers from the deck crews. Mechanics hugged them, chaplains shook their hands. Many of the airmen didn't even know which ships they had hit, only that they had survived the mission that had seemed suicidal at dawn. Lieutenant Wade McCluskey, whose squadron had delivered the fatal blows to Kaga and Akagi, later said, "We didn't just get lucky, we got information. Somebody back there cracked their code. That's who really won this battle." He was right. In the basement of Station HYPO, Rochefort's team was listening as the last Japanese transmissions faded into silence. They had done their job. They had guided Nimitz to victory without ever leaving their desks. When word of the victory reached them, there were no parades, no medals. Rochefort simply lit his pipe, looked at his men, and said, "Well, I guess we were right." But the cost of victory was steep. The Yorktown, hit by bombs and torpedoes from Hiryū's final strike, was dead in the water. For 2 days, her crew fought to save her, pumping water and sealing bulkheads, but she was struck again on June 6th by a Japanese submarine. She rolled onto her side and sank slowly beneath the waves, the only American carrier lost in the battle. Still, it was a trade any admiral would have made. 1 carrier for 4. Nimitz later summarized it in his after-action report. "This battle will be remembered as the turning point in the Pacific. Henceforth, the initiative belongs to us." And he was right. The loss of those 4 carriers, each one the product of years of construction and training, crippled Japan's ability to wage offensive war. It wasn't just ships they lost. It was the air crews, the mechanics, the leaders, the irreplaceable core of their naval air arm. Japan would build new carriers, but never again would it have the pilots to fill them. At sunset on June 5th, as the surviving American carriers turned east for Pearl Harbor, the sea around Midway was quiet once more. The fires still burned far in the distance, and the smell of burning oil drifted across the waves. The Pacific, for all its vastness, suddenly felt smaller. In his war diary, Admiral Nimitz wrote, "We have faced the enemy and defeated him. The price was heavy, but the victory decisive. May those who fought this day rest in peace upon the sea they have made sacred." The Japanese fleet had vanished into the night, limping home to a stunned empire. The Americans, scarred but unbroken, were sailing toward a new chapter, a long, bloody road of island hopping and air raids that would lead 3 years later to the very shores of Japan itself. But for now, in the calm that followed the flames, one truth was undeniable. The tide of the Pacific War had turned.
When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the world was changed. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū lay silent on the ocean floor, their twisted steel entombing thousands of Japan's finest aviators. The sea that had once carried their empire outward now held its dead. Above, the Americans who had survived Midway were sailing home to Pearl Harbor, not as victims this time, but as victors. For the first time in the war, the rising sun was in retreat. Yet as headlines around the world celebrated the miracle at Midway, few outside the Pacific Fleet understood what had really happened. To the public, it had been a clash of ships, aircraft, and courage. But to the men who truly knew, it had been something quieter, something far more profound, a victory born not from luck or heroism, but from intellect, patience, and deception. The battle had been won before the first bomb fell, in a basement where no guns were fired. Pearl Harbor, June 6, 1942. Station HYPO's small windowless room smelled of pipe smoke and stale coffee. The walls were covered with charts, notes, and cryptographic sheets pinned in layers several inches thick. The men were exhausted. Some hadn't slept in 48 hours. For months, they had been living inside a world of numbers. 33,000 five-digit groups, each a locked door. And finally, they had found the master key. Now, as intercepted Japanese traffic grew silent, Commander Joseph Rochefort took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "We've done it," one of his men whispered. Rochefort didn't reply. He simply stared at the empty sheets on his desk and said softly, "It was never about glory. It was about listening." When word of the victory reached Admiral Nimitz, he sent a short message to Station HYPO. "You have given us the battle. For that, we thank you." But there would be no public acknowledgement. Their work remained classified. Rochefort and his team faded back into obscurity, continuing to monitor Japanese communications as the war pressed onward. The world would never know that the decisive moment of the Pacific War had been born not in the skies above Midway, but in the quiet hum of a basement below Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood what few others in Japan could admit. The loss at Midway was not simply a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. His carriers could be replaced, but his pilots could not. The Imperial Navy had lost its elite, men who had trained for years in secret, veterans of China, Malaya, and Pearl Harbor. The replacements who came after would be boys with months of training, flying in machines their hands barely understood. Yamamoto himself grew quiet, somber, and fatalistic. He told a colleague, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. I feared this from the beginning." Less than a year later, Yamamoto would be dead. His transport ambushed and shot down over Bougainville by American P-38 Lightnings, guided by the very same kind of code-breaking that had doomed him at Midway. The intelligence war only grew from there. Having proven the power of cryptanalysis,
the United States expanded its code-breaking operations across the Pacific. Navy stations at Pearl Harbor, Melbourne, and Washington coordinated daily, intercepting and decrypting Japanese signals faster than ever before. They learned the routes of convoys, the movement of submarines, the exact schedules of troop transports. Every battle that followed, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, owed something to the lessons learned in that dark room at Station HYPO. To the Japanese, it was as if the Americans could read their minds. Orders sent in secrecy were answered with ambushes. Convoys vanished mid-ocean. Reinforcements arrived to find their destinations already bombed. No one in Tokyo could explain how the Americans always seemed to know. Some whispered of spies, others blamed divine punishment. But the truth was far simpler. Mathematics, logic, and the unrelenting will of a few unseen men. By the end of the war, the scale of Midway's importance became clear even to those who had not fought there. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Pacific War. But to those who lived it, it was more personal. On the deck of Enterprise, now battle-worn and patched from years of service, a sailor carved into the railing, Midway, June 1942, where everything changed. It wasn't poetry. It was truth. From that day forward, Japan never regained the initiative. The Pacific that had once been an ocean of conquest became a sea of retreat. After the war, Rochefort returned quietly to civilian life. For decades, his role in the Midway victory remained classified. Others were credited, awards went elsewhere, and Station HYPO's files were buried under new wars and new technologies. But within the small community of naval intelligence, his name became legend. They called him the man who listened to ghosts. In 1986, more than 40 years after the battle, the U.S. Navy finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. By then, the men who had worked with him were old or gone, but their pride was undiminished. "We were never heroes," one of them said at the ceremony. "We were librarians who learned how to stop an empire." In Japan, the silence left by Midway echoed for generations. It marked the end of the Imperial Navy's golden age, the day when arrogance met intelligence and lost. For the officers who had survived, it was a wound that never healed. In post-war interviews, many of them admitted they had underestimated the Americans. "We thought we were fighting soldiers. We did not know we were fighting scientists." And that, perhaps, was the true legacy of Midway. A realization that wars are not won by brute strength alone. The modern battlefield had shifted from muscle to mind, from admirals on bridges to cryptanalysts in basements, from bombs to bites, from the roar of engines to the whisper of intercepted words. Decades later, when divers found the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga lying silent under 3 miles of water, they saw something haunting. The ships were still upright, as if sailing through the deep. The rising sun was still faintly visible on their hulls, and beside them, resting in eternal formation, were the ghosts of the men who had once believed themselves invincible. Above them, the Pacific was calm again, its surface unbroken, concealing forever the place where intelligence triumphed over empire. In 1942, the world thought Midway was a naval battle. In truth, it was a war of minds, a contest between blindness and insight, arrogance and calculation, secrecy and silence. And in that war, fought in numbers instead of gunfire, America saw the enemy's thoughts before he even moved. The codebreakers had given their admirals a gift no fleet could match: knowledge. And knowledge, in the end, won the Pacific.